The blood trail led straight to his well. Tobias Hartwell had seen his share of wounded animals over the years, but this wasn't deer blood. It was darker, thicker, smeared with desperation, and the deeper he followed it around the barn, the heavier the dread in his gut became. Then he saw him, a young Apache warrior, collapsed against the cold stone of the well. One hand was pressed tight to his side, red seeping between his fingers. The other hand stretched upward, just 3 feet short of the wooden bucket hanging from the rope. His eyes, though clouded by pain, snapped to Tobias's with a look that could stop time. No fear, no pleading, just pure exhausted alertness. Tobias froze, fingers tightening on the rifle slung over his shoulder. His breath caught. In 1847, a white man finding a bleeding Indian on his property wasn't just bad luck, it was a death sentence. Every rancher within 50 miles would have told him the same thing. Put a bullet in him, bury him, say nothing. His finger hovered over the trigger. One shot and the problem would disappear. But something about those eyes held him back. In them, Tobias saw something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Not guilt, not fear, recognition. That same raw human desperation he had felt during the drought of '44, when the rivers dried up and he nearly died of thirst himself. This wasn't a savage or a soldier. This was a man, a dying man, and all he wanted, all he asked for, was water. Water, the Apache whispered, lips cracked, voice like dust on the wind. Tobias's heart pounded. His mind raced. His rifle slowly dropped. He grabbed the bucket. His hand shook as he lowered it. Every second stretched like rope pulled tight. As the warrior drank, gasping between gulps, Tobias scanned the horizon, half expecting the devil himself to crest the hill with a shotgun. He was crossing a line, a deadly line, because mercy in this part of the world could get you killed, and the sound of galloping hooves rising in the distance told him exactly how fast death was coming. Tobias Hartwell stood with his back to the stone well, the smell of blood thick in the air, his heart pounding like war drums beneath his ribs. Dust swirled across the ranch yard as 6 riders crested the ridge, their horses charging down the slope like wolves closing in on prey. At the front, unmistakable even from a distance, rode Marshal Dixon Webb. Tobias swallowed hard. Webb was the kind of man whose name arrived 2 days before he did. His reputation had seeped into every corner of the territory. Ruthless, efficient, unmerciful. He didn't just enforce the law, he bent it to suit his needs. And when it came to Indian problems, he didn't ask questions. He just pulled the trigger. Tobias didn't move. He couldn't. Behind the well, hidden just out of sight, lay the wounded Apache warrior. The man Tobias had given water to just minutes before, still bleeding, still breathing, and now both of them were caught in the path of something far more dangerous than bullets, the lie of justice in a lawman's badge. The horses skidded to a stop in the yard, hooves churning up dry earth. The 5 deputies spread out, forming a half-circle like wolves circling a wounded deer. Webb remained mounted, his pale blue eyes scanning the property with practiced menace. "Afternoon, Hartwell," he called, voice lazy, casual, like they were old friends meeting for coffee. Tobias tipped his hat, the motion stiff. "Afternoon, Marshal." Webb dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his coat with deliberate precision. That was his tell. When he was about to draw, he always got neat first. "We're tracking a wounded Indian," he said. "Blood trail led straight to your well." Tobias forced a shrug. "Ain't seen no Indians. Been working the south fence all day." Webb's eyes drifted toward the barn, then the dark stains near the well. His nostrils flared. "That so?" He took a step forward, then another. His boots thudded softly against the ground, and each one felt louder than a gunshot. Tobias's body coiled tight. If the marshal got close enough to see behind the well, it was over. For both of them. "You sure about that?" Webb asked. "Because that looks like blood to me, fresh." Tobias held his ground. "Had to put down a coyote this morning. Got too close to the chickens." Webb stopped 10 feet away, squinting. "You butcher coyotes next to your drinking water, Hartwell?" "I butcher things where I find them." Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Just that same cold certainty Tobias had seen in men who'd made up their minds to kill long before the fight started. Behind him, the deputies began shifting in their saddles. Rifles loosened in their slings. Fingers brushed against holsters. One man nudged his horse forward a few steps, casually closing the circle. They weren't here to ask. They were here to clean up. "I'll be straight with you," Webb said. "We know the Indians here. We followed the trail. The blood's fresh, and I'm guessing you're too honest a man to shoot one and not finish the job." Tobias stayed silent. "So," Webb continued, "either you're hiding him or you're about to get framed for helping him." He took another step. 5 feet now. Tobias could hear every heartbeat, every breath. He could almost feel the Apache warrior on the other side of the well, trying not to move, not to make a sound. A shift. A whisper of leather. Webb's hand rested casually on his pistol grip. "You know what the penalty is for harboring a fugitive Indian, don't you, Hartwell?" he said softly. "Same as treason. A rope around the neck till you stop twitching." Tobias's eyes didn't waver. "Man crawled onto my land half dead. I gave him water. That ain't treason. That's being human." Webb's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake." "No, Marshal," Tobias said, his voice low, steady. "You are. You came here to kill a man who hasn't said a word in his own defense. You don't want justice. You want silence." A beat of silence. Then, from behind the well, a voice rose. Not a whisper, but clear and deliberate. "Ayana." He spoke in Apache first, sharp syllables cutting through the air like blades. Then, in perfect English, "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me." The effect on Webb was instant. His hand dropped from his pistol. His eyes widened, face draining of color. Tobias turned his head slightly, eyes darting between the two men. "Who is he?" Webb's mouth opened, then shut. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "He's Ayana, son of Chief Takakota. He negotiated the Fort Richardson peace treaty." The entire ranch went still, and Tobias realized, in one blinding flash, that the wounded man behind his well wasn't just someone worth saving. He was someone worth killing, at least to the wrong people. And now they were all in the middle of something far bigger than blood on the dirt. The ranch yard was dead silent, except for the slow creak of saddles and the restless snorting of horses. Marshal Webb had gone pale, his knuckles white on the grip of his holstered revolver. His usual swagger, the cold confidence that had made him a feared name from Santa Fe to Fort Stanton, was gone, stripped away by 5 words spoken in perfect English. "Tell him who I am, Marshal." The man who had been hiding behind Tobias Hartwell's well, bleeding and half-conscious minutes ago, now stood, barely, his hand still pressed to the bullet wound at his side. But his voice carried the weight of something far larger than survival. It carried command. It carried legacy. Webb didn't answer right away. His mouth opened once, then again, like a man trying to lie but realizing there was no point. His deputies looked at him expectantly, but also with unease. The blood trail had brought them here to kill. Now they were facing a man who, by all rights, should never have been shot at all. Finally, Webb spoke. The words came slow, bitter, reluctant. "His name is Ayana, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who brokered the peace treaty with Fort Richardson." Tobias felt the ground shift beneath him. Ayana. He knew the name. Everyone in the territory did. The young warrior who had laid down arms, crossed cultural boundaries, and risked his life to speak peace where others wanted blood. He had been hailed in some papers as the future of the frontier, a bridge between worlds. And here he was, bleeding on Tobias's land, shot, hunted, accused. Ayana straightened, wincing but didn't lower his gaze. 3 days ago, he said, I rode to meet Colonel Morrison. We were discussing expanding the peace treaty to include the Southern Territories, but someone didn't want that. Webb's eyes darted sideways to one of his deputies. A flicker of something, panic, guilt, passed across his face. Ayana continued, his words sharp now. Morrison was murdered, shot in the back, the scene staged to look like an Indian ambush. I was shot too, left for dead. And someone made sure the witnesses saw just enough war paint and heard just enough Apache to place the blame where they wanted it. Tobias felt his stomach churn. You're saying they framed you? That this is political, Ayana said, corrupt and calculated. He pulled a blood-stained letter from a pouch at his side and held it out. This was written by Morrison the night before he died. It names the men behind the gun running, the ones profiting from this war continuing, including someone inside the marshal's office. All eyes turned to Webb. He didn't deny it. He didn't even move, because even he knew it wouldn't matter anymore. Deputy Bradley, the youngest of the lawmen, broke the silence. "You're saying this whole manhunt, it's just to kill you before you can speak?" Ayanna nodded. "Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't sign new treaties." Bradley looked at Webb. His face was pale. "Marshal, is this true?" Webb's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about." But no one looked convinced anymore. His men began shifting again, but not toward their weapons. Not anymore. They were stepping back, recalculating, rethinking everything they had ridden in believing. And Tobias, just a simple rancher, a man who had thought he was helping a wounded stranger, realized he was now standing at the epicenter of something far larger, something that could bring peace to the frontier or shatter it completely. And all of it started with a single act of mercy. Tobias Hartwell had lived on the frontier long enough to know that law wasn't always justice, but he'd never felt the difference burn so clearly until now. Ayanna, once thought to be just another wounded Apache, stood bloodied but unbroken, his words cutting through the evening air like a blade. The ranch yard, moments ago crackling with tension, now hummed with stunned silence as the warrior revealed the truth behind the bullet in his side. An ambush, a betrayal, and a government conspiracy designed to destroy peace for profit. 3 days ago, Ayanna had ridden to meet Colonel Morrison to expand the hard-won peace treaty between settlers and the Apache. Instead, he was met with gunfire. Morrison was dead. Ayanna was framed. And the same men who orchestrated it had sent Marshal Webb and his armed thugs to finish the job before the truth could leave this ranch alive. Tobias clenched his fists, rage crawling up his spine. They had used the same tactics they always used. Paint an Indian as the savage, spin a lie that made murder look like order, then bury the bodies deep enough no one would ask questions. And people like Webb, they didn't care who bled, so long as they got their cut of the spoils. "What you're talking about," Webb hissed, trying to recover his grip on the moment, "is treason." "No," Ayanna replied coldly. "What you're part of is treason." He held up the blood-stained letter from Colonel Morrison. His final message, written the night before he died. It named names, amounts, specific shipments of weapons sold to renegade factions, all while peace was being negotiated in broad daylight. But what chilled Tobias most wasn't the corruption. It was who had been helping cover it up. "You," Ayanna said, staring straight at Webb, "a lawman sworn to protect this land, have been protecting war for profit." The words struck like a hammer. Webb's face twitched, his hand moving to his pistol again, a cornered animal defaulting to violence. But Tobias had seen enough. He was sick of watching evil wear a badge. "You knew," Tobias said, his voice rising for the first time. "You knew Morrison wasn't killed by Apache, and you came here to kill Ayanna anyway, to bury the truth with his body." Webb turned to him, face flushed. "I had my orders." "From who?" Tobias barked. "The same men who profit every time a settler burns or a child dies in a raid they armed? You call that law?" Webb's hand tightened around his gun. But before he could act, Ayanna continued, voice unwavering. "There are men making fortunes off bloodshed, selling rifles to both sides, lighting matches under fragile peace. They staged the ambush, painted their faces, spoke just enough Apache to fool the witnesses, all so the peace would break and the land would burn again." And now Tobias understood. He understood why this wounded man had smiled, that knowing smile when the horses came, why his voice, though weak, held the power of a leader, why Webb had gone pale when he spoke. Because this wasn't just a fugitive. This was the one man who could destroy the lie that kept evil men rich, and they had sent killers to silence him. Webb looked around at his men, but their eyes were no longer loyal. Deputy Bradley had already stepped forward, shaking his head, his voice soft but firm. "Marshal, I saw some of those rifles, ones you said were stolen by Indians. I saw settlers with them, weeks ago." That admission cracked the dam. One by one, the other deputies looked away, uneasy, ashamed. Some nodded, others muttered, but Tobias saw it. They no longer trusted the man in front of them. Webb was unraveling. "You're all fools," he snapped, drawing his gun halfway. "You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone in Santa Fe will believe a blood-soaked Indian over a U.S. Marshal?" But even as he said it, Tobias could see the panic behind the fury. The mask was slipping. Ayanna didn't flinch. He raised the letter higher. "They'll believe the words of a murdered colonel. They'll believe the ledger hidden in your office. And they'll believe your own men, who are done following orders soaked in blood." Tobias stepped forward, his voice a mix of fury and contempt. "You came here to kill a man who tried to save hundreds. You nearly burned my ranch just to hide your lies. You want to talk about treason? You're standing in it." Webb trembled now, not from fear of Ayanna or Tobias or even the letter, but from losing control. For the first time in his brutal career, the truth was louder than his gun. And that, Tobias realized, was what made him most dangerous of all. Truth has a weight to it. Not like iron or stone, but heavier somehow. When it lands, it doesn't shout. It doesn't kick down doors. It just sits, undeniable, and dares the world to keep lying. That was the feeling in Tobias Hartwell's ranch yard when the truth finally landed. Ayanna stood bloodied but unbowed beside the old stone well, the letter from Colonel Morrison trembling in his hands. Around him, 6 armed deputies stood frozen, their fingers inches from their holsters, but none of them moved, because the words Ayanna had just spoken were heavier than any bullet. "This is why they tried to kill me," he said, holding the blood-stained page higher. "Colonel Morrison discovered who's been selling weapons to the renegade tribes. Names, shipments, dates. This letter proves it, and it names someone in the territorial marshal's office." The accusation didn't need to be spelled out. All eyes turned to Marshal Webb. He didn't speak. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, but the usual fire in his eyes was gone. What flickered there now wasn't fury, it was fear. And Tobias saw it. So did the deputies. "You lied to us," Deputy Bradley said, voice tight with disbelief. "You said Ayanna killed Morrison. You said we were stopping a war, but you were just covering your tracks." Webb's hand hovered over his pistol. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Bradley didn't back down. "I remember that missing shipment of rifles 3 months ago. You blamed it on an Apache raid, but I saw settlers riding south with those same guns. I didn't say anything then because I thought, maybe I was wrong." He swallowed. "But I wasn't." Another deputy, older, grizzled, nodded. "I remember that too, and that warehouse fire in Santa Fe. You said it was an accident, but the logs didn't match the insurance claim." One by one, the men around Webb stopped being soldiers. They started being witnesses. Webb's voice cracked under the pressure. "You think anyone's going to believe him over me?" Ayanna didn't respond with anger. He didn't need to. He simply held the letter out again, like scripture. "This is Morrison's handwriting," he said quietly. "He gave it to me the night before he died. He knew something was coming, and he told me, if anything happened to him, I had to bring this to Fort Richardson." Tobias stepped forward, his eyes locked on Webb. "And you were going to make sure that never happened. That's why you followed the blood trail. That's why you came to my ranch, not to arrest him, but to finish what your partners started." Webb turned on him, voice rising. "I've kept this territory safe for years. You think you know better? You think you're a hero now for giving a savage water?" "I think," Tobias said evenly, "I'd rather be remembered for saving one life than helping bury the truth." It wasn't just about Ayanna anymore. This was bigger. Rot had seeped into the foundations of their law, and now the daylight was exposing it. Bradley pulled a paper from his saddlebag and stepped forward. "Marshal Webb, this came this morning. A direct order from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended pending a full investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb's face drained of color. "You had this the whole time?" "You didn't give me a chance to read it," Bradley replied coldly. "You just barked orders and told us to ride." "You little traitor," Webb growled. But even as he reached for his gun, the circle had closed around him. 4 deputies now had their weapons raised, not at Ayanna, not at Tobias, but at their own commanding officer. The silence stretched, thick, heavy. Webb's only remaining ally, a grizzled deputy named Hawkins, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly calculating his odds. He saw what everyone else did. The tide had turned. Because truth doesn't need to shout to change a room. It just needs to exist long enough for good men to remember who they are. Webb finally lowered his hand, his mouth a tight line of fury and defeat. He looked at Ayana with loathing, but also resignation. "You think this changes anything?" Ayana answered softly. "It already has. They came like thunder rolling off the mountains, 50 Apache warriors on horseback, their formation tight, their presence undeniable. Dust rose in spirals behind them, backlit by the setting sun. Their war paint glinted like molten copper, their eyes hard as obsidian. But their weapons stayed sheathed, their hands remained calm. And that made their arrival even more powerful. Tobias Hartwell stood rooted beside the well, unable to look away. He had seen war parties before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a charge, it was a message. At their head rode an elder, regal, upright, eyes sharp despite the deep lines of age. His long gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and he carried no weapon. He didn't need one. This was Chief Takakota. Tobias didn't need an introduction. The air around him seemed to bend with reverence, as the Apache riders fanned into a wide, protective circle around the ranch. A hum of energy rippled across the land. It wasn't fear, it was commanding presence, the kind that didn't beg to be respected. It demanded it. Webb's pistol still trembled in his hand, now pointed not at Ayana, but at Tobias. His face was a war of rage, panic, and disbelief. This wasn't what he'd prepared for. He'd expected an ambush or a raid, not this display of controlled power. "You did this," he snarled at Tobias. "You helped him signal them." Tobias didn't flinch. "I gave a dying man water, that's all." But it wasn't all. Everyone there knew it. That single act had pulled back a curtain and revealed a deeper truth, one soaked in treachery, greed, and silence too long accepted. The hoofbeats fell silent. The chief dismounted and strode toward his son. His steps were steady, deliberate. As he reached Ayana, he placed his weathered hands on the young man's shoulders, searching his face with paternal intensity. The reunion was quiet, but the air around it was electric. This wasn't just a father greeting a son. It was a leader witnessing the survival of hope. When they finally embraced, a wave of emotion broke over the assembled Apache riders. Their faces didn't soften, but their silence deepened. In that moment, Tobias understood he was standing in the center of something sacred. Then, the chief turned to Webb. His English was perfect. "Marshal Webb," he said, voice calm and crisp, "my son tells me you came here to murder him." Webb's grip on his pistol tightened. "I came to arrest a fugitive." The chief didn't blink. "A fugitive from your own corruption." The accusation struck harder than any bullet. Webb's remaining deputy, Hawkins, began to slowly back his horse away, clearly calculating his escape. "We have Morrison's letter," the chief continued. "We have the confessions of the real killers, who died trying to flee Apache justice. And we have your correspondence, every shipment, every bribe, every lie." He motioned to a warrior who stepped forward with a satchel. Inside were papers, too many to deny. Webb went pale. "This changes nothing," he muttered. The chief stepped closer. "You're wrong. It changes everything." Suddenly Webb raised his pistol, wild-eyed, desperate. "If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me." He swung the barrel toward Ayana, but in that instant, like lightning out of a clear sky, Tobias tackled him to the ground. The gun fired, but the bullet went wide. Dust exploded as the two men hit the earth. Webb struggled, snarling like a cornered wolf, but Tobias held on with everything he had. His rage no longer cold or quiet. It was full, it was earned, and it was justified. When the fight ended, Webb lay still, his pistol kicked aside. The circle of Apache warriors stood unmoving, not a single arrow drawn, because they hadn't come for war. They had come to witness truth, and they had seen enough. As Tobias sat up, coughing dust, he felt hands reach down to help him. One of them was Ayana's, the other belonged to the chief himself. "You have our respect," the elder said, "and something more." And in that moment, under a burning sky and surrounded by the warriors of a nation, Tobias Hartwell realized he had become part of something larger than himself. Not because he fought, not because he bled, but because he stood. The sun was beginning to set behind the distant hills when the final shot was fired. Dust hung in the air like the last breath of violence, suspended between what had been and what now would never be again. Marshal Webb lay pinned beneath Tobias Hartwell, unconscious, his pistol kicked far from reach. Deputy Hawkins, seeing the tide had fully turned, raised his hands in surrender. The other deputies, now loyal to the truth rather than the badge, moved quickly to restrain both men. It was over. The Apache warriors did not cheer. They did not raise their weapons. They simply stood in silent reverence, eyes fixed on Ayanna, the wounded son of Chief Takakota, who had refused to die, refused to be silenced, and who now stood alive, breathing, a living rebuke to every lie that had tried to bury him. Chief Takakota stepped forward, his voice solemn. "Let no one say this land cannot know peace," he said, turning to the circle of witnesses around him. "But peace only comes when brave men do more than survive. They must choose honor over fear." Then he turned to Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher, a man who had once believed the world was too far gone to change, a man who only wanted to give water to a dying soul. But that water had become a lifeline, for Ayanna, for the treaty, and for the fragile thread of peace between two peoples too long at war. The chief placed his hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke words in Apache, then turned to Ayanna for translation. "He says," Ayanna explained, voice thick with emotion, "you are now brother to our people, not by blood, but by choice, because you acted when others stood silent, because you risked everything to help someone you had every reason to fear, because you saw a man, not a savage, a person, not an enemy." Tobias could only nod, humbled beyond words. For years he had lived with no purpose beyond survival. Now he was being called something more than a man, a brother. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had witnessed. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a wide circle around him. One by one, they stepped forward, touching his arm or his shoulder, not as a greeting but as a rite, a silent acknowledgement of kinship, of courage, of earned respect. When the last man had stepped forward, Chief Takakota brought out a war lance, wrapped in cloth and trimmed with eagle feathers. He held it with both hands as if bearing the weight of generations. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said, "and his father before him. It has never left the hands of our bloodline, until now." With reverence, he placed the lance into Tobias's arms. "You carry it not as a warrior of war, but as a warrior of peace." Tears stung Tobias's eyes, unexpected and unhidden. He had done what he believed any decent man should do, but decency had become so rare, so endangered, that even the smallest act of courage had become something worth honoring. The next day, the Apache riders departed, escorting Ayanna to Fort Richardson with Morrison's letter in hand. The evidence would dismantle the corruption, expose the gun runners, and clear Ayanna's name. It would also secure the expansion of the peace treaty to include southern tribes, an outcome that might never have come to pass if Tobias had chosen fear over compassion. Marshal Webb and Deputy Hawkins were tried and convicted within weeks, guilty of treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Their downfall was swift, public, and final. But the story that lived longer wasn't about their fall. It was about Tobias Hartwell, a man who gave a stranger water, and in doing so, helped save a nation from war. For years to come, children of both settler and Apache blood would grow up hearing the story of the rancher who stood before a war party with empty hands, who faced down a corrupt marshal with nothing but his principles, and who changed the course of the frontier by acting with quiet, unwavering courage. He had no medals, no monuments, but the war lance remained mounted above his hearth, and the name Tobias Hartwell, once unknown outside a dusty stretch of land, became something sacred in the mouths of those who valued truth over fear and peace over profit. Sometimes it really is that simple. One act of mercy, one cup of water, one moment of choosing to see humanity in the eyes of someone you were told to hate. That's how the world changes. In the harsh and unforgiving world of the Old West, one man's simple act of compassion became the turning point in a battle far greater than himself. Tobias Hartwell didn't set out to be a hero. He just gave a wounded stranger a drink of water. But that moment of mercy unraveled a conspiracy, exposed deep corruption, and saved a fragile peace between two peoples on the brink of war. The lesson is clear. Doing the right thing doesn't always look grand, but it always matters. In a time when distrust, fear, and division threatened everything, it was empathy, quiet, human empathy, that changed the course of history. This story reminds us that you don't need power or position to make a difference. You just need courage to act, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's dangerous, even when everyone else tells you to turn away. Tobias chose humanity over hatred, truth over silence, and because of that, peace had a chance to grow. In our modern world, the battles may look different, but the need for courage, compassion, and moral clarity is just as urgent. Every choice you make, every act of kindness or truth-telling, ripples further than you realize. If these stories move you, if you believe the past holds lessons we still need today, subscribe to our channel. Here, we tell powerful, forgotten tales from the Wild West, stories of grit, redemption, and ordinary people who shaped history through extraordinary choices. Don't miss the next story. It might just remind you who you really are.